Hello, welcome to the Enchanted Kingdom of Hermione. I'm the Lord Chamberlain of the Kingdom, Zip Gun. We're up here in the Turret of Pleasure, watching people race schwim wagons, and we're listening to the 10-hour-long version of my favorite song, Badger. And, and I'm reviewing books. I did a review a while back of books about record labels, which I've been reading a lot about. The record business, especially of the formative years of my life, 50s, 60s, 70s. And I went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 11, or 12 the record label histories, all kinds of things. Warner's, CBS, Zapple, Impulse. I'll buy any of them, and a lot of them are very cheap, thrift store stuff. Very few of them are expensive. Today I want to focus on people that worked in the industry. These are the people that actually made the industry what it was. And I think in this video I'm going to stick to 6 different books that are all about basically record executives, if you will. And there's legendary ones. There's a few that nobody, at least I can't find books about them. There's nobody to my knowledge has written a book about Mo Austin of Warner's, nor Joe Smith, he worked for a lot of companies, really, Capitol. And there's a few other guys. Dave Geffen, I wouldn't doubt there's a book there, I haven't found it yet. He'd be an interesting read. But here's the ones I've got and found, including a couple of recent ones. I've been putting this off because I was waiting for books to show up. And I'm glad I did. The first book I ever bought and read in this sort of category was the book Clive by Clive Davis. Now, this is the story of Clive Davis's beginnings with rise up in CBS Records. Now, Clive is a very influential figure in rock music. He was just a lawyer. He was like a bean counter, he was into music, but it wasn't his life or anything. But he just sort of had a knack. He inherited a label that was a huge label. But it was really flabby, and it had no cachet. They had guys like Miles Davis. They had guys like Igor Stravinsky. But their rock and roll wasn't particularly anything. They didn't really have any. I'm trying to think of anybody significant that was signed before Clive was hired. And when did he? I forget when he was hired. 64? 65. So I think they might have had Paul Revere and the Raiders. But he showed up and it was all different. He promoted rock music in the corporate halls of CBS, and he signed. Well, first one he signed was Donovan, which is kind of weird, but it worked. It took off. He picked up a lot of stuff that was cast off, but when Capitol passed on it, because they had first refusal of a lot of EMI stuff, and we'll get to that later, but he picked up a lot of that stuff and made hay with it. The Hollies, the Yardbirds, the Dave Clark Five. And then he really got cooking. He signed Janis Joplin. He signed Sly and the Family Stone. And really took over the music business using CBS's clout and its bigness to, and he could actually create records, that weren't even really very good and make them, like Moby Grape, who were okay, but he made them bigger than they were. And, he took bands like the Byrds and really made them fly. And even stuff like Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Chicago, Gary Puckett, the Union Gap. Ooh, yeah, they had hits. The Raiders and stuff. So he was really killing it until he got caught. I'm not exactly sure why he got fired. He had been playing fast and loose with his expenses, if I remember right. got the company to pay for a bar mitzvah or something that maybe he shouldn't have done. But I think it was more of a corporate power struggle, and that was the excuse. Anyways, that book covers up to that point in his life, and he was shocked and appalled and hurt, and took a year off to sort of lick his wounds and write that book. Well, wouldn't you know it, he came back too long afterwards as the head of a new label called Arista. And Arista was a Bertelsmann music group sort of thing, and they created this new label out of what was once Bell Records, which was a kind of a sad sack label that had had a few hits, but it wasn't anything like a big label. And God, these are dirty. I haven't read this one. Now, this book, the Clive book, is really interesting. There's some great stories in it. Great story about him meeting Sly Stone. Great story about Janis Joplin wanting to fuck him. Clive is kind of his own biggest fan, and you gotta kind of watch. These stories might be filtered through his own personal lens, just say. Anyways, this is the story of the Arista years. Now, I was hoping this would be good, but it's really dull, and it's all about the star-making machinery, really. Whitney Houston and all these, Now, this contains the Columbia story in it, and you know what? It's been a while since I read either of these. I don't remember how well it jives with the earlier one or not, but fully half this book is the Columbia years, and they're pretty interesting. But then you get into things like Dionne Warwick and, Eurythmics, what? Anyway, I found that as this book goes on, I lose interest in it because the artists that he's championing pop stars. He's not really into the music as much. And I found this book actually quite a disappointment. And I think I bought it in full pop. I'm not sure. A book I have talked about on this channel much, but I'm going to talk about it again because it fits this thing perfectly. Stan Cornen's book, Exploding. He was a very early member of the staff of Warner Brothers Records back in like 1960 or so. So he was there for every major thing that happened in the whole story of what we like to call WEA, Warner Electro-Atlantic. He's a very funny guy. He was in charge of their promotions. He wrote some groundbreaking advertising. He had lots of good ideas to promote records that really worked. And he's pretty much a legend in the industry. He's dead now, sadly. Now, my dear friend Andy Kerr gave me this. He found it in Amsterdam in a bookstore. And I've mentioned it before, but this is the best possible overview of the whole Warner's story, if you will. Warner Music, whatever you want to call it. And it's a pretty broad overview, but it's also got enough detail to satisfy all but the hungriest. But I am one of the hungriest. And so, part of the story of Exploding is the story of Atlantic Records, which he tells in quite remarkable detail. But I wanted a bit more, and there are several biographies about Mr. Atlantic. He was one of the original partners. He ended up being the only real original guy in the company. He was there till he died. Ahmet Ertegun, who back in 1949, along with Herb Abramson, formed Atlantic. They put out 78s of R&B music, and they just played it fast and loose for a few years. And they had, some success. Ahmet was the son of a Turkish ambassador to America, and he and his brother Nesui were jazz maniacs. They had segregated jam sessions at the embassy, which was completely, outrageous in those days. But they were Turks; they didn't care. And when their dad suddenly died, and they were suddenly like, "Oh, well, we can't live in the embassy anymore," Nesui went to L.A. He stayed in New York, formed the label with Herb. Herb's wife Miriam was also well, I guess she wasn't a partner at first, but then when Herb got called away to Germany to join the army and be a dentist, And so suddenly there was Miriam doing the whatever office work, and Amit doing the kind of signing and recording the records in their office, which was their studio. And so they needed another guy, and Jerry Wexler showed up. He'd been writing for Billboard, and he talked his way into the company. He bought himself in. I think he bought 12% or something for $3,000. And he started recording, and everything just took right off. They started having all kinds of little hits and making some truly classic music. And, Ray Charles got signed, and really, really classic, what they now call classic Atlantic R&B. And Herb got back from Germany. Unfortunately, he had a pregnant German girlfriend with him. So that kind of signaled the end of his marriage. But that meant that Miriam was now part of the team because she got part of his stock. So they were basically four of them. So Herb tried to sort of fit back in, and he had a lot of trouble, and he just couldn't find the formula. And he signed a guy named Bobby. They formed a label for him called Atco. And that was going to be Herb's own little domain. And Atco kind of didn't do much. And he signed a guy named Bobby Darin, did a bunch of singles, didn't do anything. So finally he was going to let him go. He says, I'm going to give him his release. Ahmet says, let me try. I've been hearing him in the lobby playing the piano. He sounds good. So they do Splish Splash. It's a huge hit. Herb is like, well, what the fuck? What's wrong with me? And in a moment of, I don't know what, insanity, he says later, he demands that they buy him out. Oh, no, actually, just before this, I should say, it's now decided that this just happens before he demands them be bought out. They need a guy because now the LP record is coming in, and they need somebody to help them with LPs because they don't know anything about LPs, and they don't know anything about artwork because most of the records don't have artwork. And Ahmet, who was always very close to his brother Nesui had been out west. He'd been making records for little tiny labels, strictly jazz records. And he got an offer from Imperial Records, which back then was a big label. And they were going to maybe start a jazz side to them, and they were going to hire Nesui to do it. So Nesui figures, I better phone my brother and tell him this. And Ahmet goes, no, don't do that. Jesus, they're our biggest competitor. Come to New York and we'll make you a partner. And you do that for us. So Nesui goes, sure, great. So they give him stock. So now you have Ahmet, Nesui, Jerry Wexler, Herb, and Miriam. Herb has had enough. He says, I can't compete. Buy me out. And so they do. They buy Herb out, and they're left with Miriam. Miriam is very efficient. She doesn't take any shit from anybody. But after a while, her and especially Jerry just can't get along. So they say, what's your price to sell? They give it to her. She goes out, according to Stan Cornin. She waves the check as she leaves. Says, I'll give you assholes 6 months. So now it's Jerry, Nesui, and Ahmet. And they go on a run from about, I don't know when this would be, 56, 57, and they go on a run for about 10 years where they really cook. Nesui starts the jazz division and signs John Coltrane, Charlie Mingus, Herbie Mann. I'm blanking. I'll tell you in a minute. And so they go on. 1967, they sell the company to Seven Arts for not very much money, $7 million, I think it was, and they immediately regret it. And but they threatened to walk. I said, well, we're not going to work for you then. And so Seven Arts re-ups their contracts with really, really good stock options and whatnot. And then Seven Arts is in turn bought by Kinney, and it all turns into We-Up. So now they're working for, they don't own their own label. They're working for the label, but they have considerable independence. And they get into, Jerry Wexler signs Led Zeppelin, they get into rock, and they really get big in the 70s. This is the story of Ahmet. Now, Ahmet stayed at Atlantic for his whole career and went through a variety of he always had some guys under him. He didn't do a lot of work in the office. He wouldn't show up until about 4 in the afternoon. But, he was the reason the Stones signed with Atlantic. He talked music, one of the last guys to talk music. He signed like Paolo Nutini, I think his name is. Even when he was really, really old. And sadly, he was at a Rolling Stones gig, fell and banged his head, and basically that was it for him. And he died. Kind of fitting, kind of sad. This is an excellent book. It talks a lot about the man. He was a complicated fellow. And The Last Sultan is a reference to the Turkish angle. Now, in reading this, there was another book out called The Music Men. And it was written by a couple of journalists, female journalists, that didn't have any association with the company or anything. They were outsiders. And it was pretty good, but it was just a little bit kind of on the surface. This book has a lot more detail, talks to a lot more insiders, I think. And but in reading these books and reading Cornyn's book, I started to wonder if there was any kind of book about Nesui, because Nesui is a really underrated figure. And as it turns out, there isn't a book about Nesui. He was a very private man. But, and I knew this, but I kind of ignored it. In 2008, Rhino Handmade? Yeah, Rhino Handmade made a really great box set. And here it is. I bought it. Homage à Nesui. Homage à Nesui. The Homage to Nesui 60th Anniversary Collection 10-inch 5 CD box set. Now, I didn't, when this came out originally, I said, shit, I got most of this stuff. Turns out, no, I don't. But a lot of it is not what I would call super high priority. But when I started wondering where I would find out the story of Nesui, I didn't realize that this came with a bloody great book. And so I kind of bought this for the book, believe it or not. And the book is not transcendent. It's a little bit of a love letter. It's got an interesting feature about it in that the majority of the essay, and it's really a long essay, it's sort of a short book, is written by Joel Dorn, who was a long-time Atlantic staff producer who was hired. He did a few freelance things in the early days, and Nesui he bugged Nesui and bugged Nesui and bugged Nesui. Let me record records for you. Come on, let me be a producer. Nesui said, no, that's my job. But as Nesui got bigger and bigger in the corporation, he had less and less time to go see bands and whatnot. And so he finally phoned Joel Dorn up and said, you know what? Come up and be my producer. You can produce all the acts. Oh, here's the old, the Emperor is here. And so Joel Dorn came in and produced a lot of records for Atlantic, sort of under the tutelage of Nesui, who then, in about 72, Nesui got kicked up the corporate ladder to head WIA International, which was the company that started all the WIA companies in places like Austria and Italy and Germany and France and Denmark and Norway and England and wherever. And it was a pretty big job because during his stay at WIA International, they grew WIA International by huge leaps and bounds until it was accounting for about 40% of their sales. So it was a very important job. And Nesui did that job pretty exclusively from about 72 on. So he didn't have a lot of time to do record dates. So Dorn did those. Dorn's essay in here is very heartfelt. And what makes it even more touching is that he finished the writing, they finished off the mastering, everything was ready to go. It went to the plant, and 2 days later, Joel Dorn passed away. Now, Nesui died young. I think he was in 1991. He got stuck in the big power struggle at WIA, which is very well documented in Cornyn's book, where heads were rolling all over the place, and one of the easier ones to kill off for the guys that wanted the power was Nesui. They kept saying he was old and outmoded and blah, 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 and we should replace him with somebody that knew what they were doing. And so he kind of got the green wiener And so, to placate him, if you will, I guess, they finally set up a final label which was a label called East West, which was a name they'd used God knows when before, 1954. And there in the twilight of his career, unburdened by stupid things like whether or not people were unloading the copies of Superman on videotape at the docks in Spain, he got to just sit down and make some good jazz records again. And he might have made about 6. I found about 5 or 6. He did a Adam Makovich. He did a modern jazz quartet, did a Milton Jackson. And then he got cancer. And he got pretty sick pretty quick, and he died. Once he was sort of out, like they just didn't even renew his contract after his contract ran out after about a year of East West, I guess. And so he kind of just went and worked for the anti-piracy crowd and was very, very good at it. He was a very funny guy. There's a few really great personal stories. He was very competitive. He played table tennis with them, God help you, or whatever. He had to win, but he was very quiet. He had full command of every situation. Very much an aristocrat. And the Cornyn book has lots of great stories about him. The Dorn part of this book has lots of great stories about him. And I'm glad I bought it. I got it for about $100, maybe a little more. 8 years ago now, a lot of these Rhino handmade box sets are impossible to find. They're sold out. This one I don't think is that long sold out. And they didn't seem to appreciate in value, which is a goddamn shame. Because Nesui was a really big figure in the music business from 1955 to 75. Not much talk about stuff I was hoping to know more about. They mention Vortex Records and they mention Embryo Records, but that's all they do. Someday I'll find out the stories of those labels. But it's a great book. It's a great book. I'm glad to have bought it. I admire him a lot. Oh, and the thing you saw me playing with, there's 10 beautiful prints by the guy that did all their covers in the 50s. John Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, that one of Nesui. And I'm going to try and find a 10-inch frame and just change them over every so often. So that was a great book to buy. Finally, this is going to be a long video, folks. Sorry. Finally, I found a copy of this. Now, I wanted this. I sort of knew about this guy. He's kind of a footnote in history. If you're a serious Beatle fan, you know who this guy is. Otherwise, you might not. And I heard about this man's influence on popular music, and I started to wonder, what the fuck? And then I found out he had written a book. And I said, well, I gotta find this book. Well, I did, but people wanted stupid amounts of money for it. And I just don't do that. I bought one stupid amount of money book, which was Norman Smith's book. That was worth buying because it's such a weird book. But I found this for $10 on a cheapo book website. It was about $30 to my door from Fuckwater, Kansas or something. And this book, and there's no dust jacket, I don't care. And this book is Playback by Dave Dexter Jr. Now, Dave Dexter Jr., in 25 words or less, is the living embodiment of Typhoid Mary in the music business. This guy was handed the key to the universe and threw it away 3 times before his boss said, you're taking this fucking key and you're going to open that fucking Pandora's box. And the key in this question is, well, I'll get to it later. I'll build up to this. Now, Dexter started out as a record reviewer for Downbeat. Pretty good gig. I think he took his craft rather seriously. And I don't think I've read any of his reviews. Certainly, I've never read any of them that I would sort of understand the context of, because he was a jazz beau. He dug jazz. And he would review this and that. He was very critical. He reviewed some Frank Sinatra early sides very critically. And apparently not in a nice way. Because Mr. Sinatra, who was known to hold a grudge or so, remembered. And after doing a fair, he's from St. Louis. He's a Midwestern guy, worked with people like Jay McShann. I mean, he clearly knows his jazz. And he's not an idiot. It's not like he's got no taste. But he was a very prejudiced, xenophobic, jazz bow traditionalist who was not receptive to new sounds. And he was not receptive to advice from his higher ups. And this got him, well, ultimately was the end of him. But all through the 50s, he joined Capitol Records. And it ended up being one of their A&R guys. It was him and Voyle Gilmore and a few others. And through his sort of machinations, they managed to sign Frank Sinatra. Well, Frank Sinatra at the time wasn't huge, but he became huge very quickly on Capitol. However, the minute Sinatra was on Capitol, the first thing he did was tell them, well, I don't want Dexter producing me because I think he's an asshole. And that didn't bode well. So they had, okay, good. He signed Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole did very well for Capitol. Capitol started in what, 1949? And it took off. And inside of, well, it might have been 48 or 47, but inside of 10 years, Capitol was a really major label in the States. They were getting lots of hits. They had Peggy Lee, Sinatra, Cole, lots of good, smooth music. And Capitol was started by Johnny Mercer, who was a songwriter, and a couple of other guys. And they all kind of lost interest in the label more than anything. And so in 1955, EMI, Electric and Musical Industries of England, came calling, and they bought Capitol Records. English label. Bought Capitol Records, which this caused a certain amount of consternation at the office in LA. And Dexter's like, do we all still have jobs? Oh, yeah, no. You just keep doing what you're doing. Okay, great. But part of the new wrinkle of this was that EMI of England would send them copies of everything they put out in England with an eye towards getting it put out by Capitol in the States. And hopefully Capitol would pick the stuff up and put it out. If not, then they would try to find another place for it in America. And Dexter kind of hated this. And by this point, Dexter had been kind of promoted to because they were now an international company, he was made the head of the sort of international division. And one of his innovations was to make these, beer barrel polka music from Germany. He had a series of the world, Capitol. And they did pretty good. They were cheap to make. They were kind of like folk music, but not really folk music. Not really world music. Kind of world pop music. Pop tunes from Scandinavia, or folk tunes mostly. But they had a whole bunch of them. And they all kind of sold decently. And he busied himself doing that all through the 50s. And, he was pretty much happy doing that and pulling his weight. There was no international, he'd go all over the world listening to records in India, and he's like, oh, nobody's going to buy this in California. But a funny thing happened. One little side note in this book that's really cool is he gets a phone call from a guy in Fresno, a DJ. And he goes, hey, Dave, I got this single. I got it from Japan, and I'm playing it because I play the odd Japanese single on my show because there's all these Japanese farm workers in the Fresno Valley. And he goes, I got this one song, and I played it, and everybody went nuts. The switchboard just lit up. And he says, every time I play it, the switchboard lights up. You should maybe look into this song. And Dave goes, what is it? He goes, well, it's some girl singing. And I don't know what, it's all in Japanese. So he goes, a girl singing, I think it might be a hit in Japan. I'm not sure. Anyway, Dave phones up his friends at Toshiba EMI in Tokyo and says, you got some girl singing a song about I put my face to the sky so I don't cry or something? And they go, no, that's not a girl. That's a guy. That's Ryo Sakamoto. Oh, yeah, what the hell is it called? It's called, and I can't pronounce it, it's, I don't know. It's many syllables of very difficult to pronounce Japanese, which I think loosely translated means I turn my face up so the tears don't fall, or something along those lines. And Dave is like, well, that's okay, send me a copy. So they send him a copy, and this is kind of funny. They send him a Japanese pressing, which is so good that he simply plays that pressing into the cutting lathe. That became the American single. And it's a terrific sounding single. And of course, the single is what we all over here know as Sukiyaki. And they called it Sukiyaki because he says nobody's going to get their tongue around that title. And we might as well just give it the name of the most recognizable Japanese word in America. Now, this is kind of an amazing thing when you consider this is what, 18 years after Hiroshima? So it was a #1 hit. And he just fallen into his lap. So he's a big man on campus, great. Um, and life goes on. He keeps getting singles from England, and they're just one after the other, straight into the trash. I don't want this. I don't want this. I don't want this. I don't want this. And he hardly puts anything out from England, literally almost nothing. And England's getting kind of pissed. They're like, hey, there's got to be something. No, it's all shit. I don't like any of it. Yeah, so he gets this one single, and he's like, oh, another one of these fucking beat groups. Listen to that terrible harmonica. And he throws it in the bin, and it's Love Me Do. And Love Me Do in England kind of makes a little bit of a stir. Yeah, gets going. Yeah, it's England, whatever. The guy in Canada, what's his name? Young. God, I can't remember his first name. He listens to it and goes, you know what, there might be something here. So he picks it up for Capital in Canada, which mercifully for Capital of Canada, they have a different deal with EMI in England. He starts picking up these weird records by these Beatles guys. Dexter hates it. Nope, don't want it. So they take it to VJ, which is the last place in the world it should go. And VJ puts it out. And Dexter's like, see, I told you, So then they put out, what is it? There's a Place? What's the second single? And again, no, I don't like these guys. Don't send me any more of this shit. And VJ puts it out. By this point, VJ is, out of control. And they go broke. Dexter then gets She Loves You. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, She Loves You embodies the Beatles in one song. It was the first song I heard that had everybody going, she loves you, yeah, 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 all around the kindergarten playground where I was. And I didn't like that one either. So it ended up on a label called Swan, and I had difficulty getting my head around this. They sold 800 copies of it. So Dexter's sitting there, see, I was right. Okay, well, meanwhile, in England, the world is going insane. Everything is about the Beatles. They're selling records hand over fist. It's Beatlemania. And in Canada, they've taken up. People are like, And finally, Dexter's boss, a nice man named Alan Livingston, calls Dexter into his office and says, hey, there's a new Beatles single coming out. And Dexter, the way I've heard it, Dexter goes, yeah. And he goes, no, you don't understand, Dave. We're putting this single out. It's coming out. We're putting all our resources and promotion behind it. Okay, he was given no choice. In the book, he claims to have been played the single and saying to the fellow at EMI, whose name escapes me, well, who's this? And he goes, it's the Beatles. He goes, this can't be the Beatles. It's too good. Now, I don't know about you, but the same band that made She Loves You is the band that made I Want to Hold Your Hand. And to not be able to tell those bands that those two singles are by the same band, I think he's kind of full of shit. So, anyways, he basically gets told, you are putting this record out. So Dave decides, well, good company man that he is, these limeys don't know anything about anything. This is his attitude. So George Martin is just a bloody fool, and these records don't sound very good, I don't think. I can make them sound better. Dexter takes them, and on some of them, she's a woman. He puts all this reverb on it, and then he takes the mono recordings and puts them into this fake stereo. And these don't sound good. And people like me, my childhood was almost ruined. Well, not ruined, because the music wills out. But the mixes are dog shit. And I'll tell you what, when I finally heard the British mixes when I was an adult, I couldn't believe how much better they sounded. Long story short, Dave would, monkey with the sound, never improving it, although he claimed that Paul phoned him and said how much he liked the new sound. Now, knowing Paul, who was sort of the oiler of waters of the Beatles, I can't believe he really meant that. He was just saying something to make Dave happy because he didn't have much control over what Dave did at that point. So Dave merrily damaged these records, and then he would repackage them. Because in America, you pay 2 cents a song to the publisher, whereas in England, you pay X amount per album, if I remember the difference being. So it behooved the American label to cheap out and not use the 14-song album masters of the British, but to make it as little as 11. And you could save songs and make, with 2 albums worth of saved songs, you can make a 3rd album. Now, this is great, commercial sense, but it really fucking ruined the records thematically, and the Beatles hated it. And Paul maybe didn't make such a fuss, but you know that John did. Now, you're not going to believe this, but John Lennon this guy is not a fan of John Lennon. And so ultimately, John complains. Dexter calls him a fucking whiner. The Help movie comes out. They didn't get the soundtrack to Hard Day's Night. That was given to United Artists, and he was really pissed. But it was a deal they'd made when he was busy rejecting them. So, you're a fucking problem. By the way, meanwhile, he had rejected also the Animals right before House of the Rising Sun, the Hollies, the Yardbirds, the Dave Clark Five, Jerry and the Pacemakers. I can't remember who else. A lot of bands. He probably cost Capitol Records $10 or $15 million in the 60s, and that was a lot of money. So he was just a pig-headed fool. And meanwhile, he's having his way fooling around with the Beatles records. And finally, the Beatles did Help. And in England, Help was half soundtrack record, half whatever. And Capitol didn't want to do that because in the States, soundtrack records are more expensive. And they often have music from the score. Now, nobody buying a Beatles record wants the fucking score, but they knew that if they used the score to pad out the movie songs, of which I think there were 5 or maybe 6, they could not only glean a whole album out of it, but they could charge a premium price for it. And so, even though even Alan Livingston thought it was kind of a ripoff, they did it. It sold 1.5 million copies, of course, because you can sell a record. They sold the Beatles story, which was another Dexter idea, which again, the Beatles just loathed that. One Beatles record, I don't think I've ever even heard that. And it was the most expedient product. It was just, So, in dealing with his superiors in England, Dexter got kind of lippy. Royal Gilmore calls him into the office and says, yeah, we're going to put another guy in charge of your portfolio. Oh, what am I going to do? We're going to assign you for reissue stuff. Because they had done a deal with Pickwick where old deleted Capitol titles were then gone through by Pickwick, who would choose what they wanted and put them out on Pickwick. And this would be Dexter's new domain, which, as you might expect, was something of a kick downstairs. And it was something he knew about, but it was not very glamorous, and he was really fucking choked. He did this for some time. And then finally, meanwhile, the guy that took over his job was actually, if anything, even worse, because he was part of the debacle with Yesterday and Today, and then they completely fucked up the Canadian version of Revolver, American version of Revolver, which has 2 John Lennon songs on it, as opposed to 3 George Harrison songs, which even I, as a 7-year-old, thought was weird. And so finally, when the Beatles contract came up in '67, John came up and said, absolutely, you get the records the way we give them to you. That is it. No more of this fucking bullshit. And so that was the end of that. Use our mixes, everything. Dexter toiled away from, when would it have been, 66 to about 74 in what he called a job without a title. And he just sat there and, he kept cashing his paycheck, which I'll bet was significant. And then finally, after Bashar Menon took over and Capitol, once the Beatles broke up, was fucked. They were a garbage label. They were run by idiots. They signed hardly anybody good. And they went from being, Capitol was number 1 briefly, thanks to the Beatles. They had something like five of the top 5 slots in the charts. How do you not be number 1? But because they pissed off the Beatles so much, and then the Beatles finally just, the goose that laid the golden egg died, they were suddenly stuck with a lot of stuff that wasn't really that good. And so Dexter was the old guy that everybody wanted to forget about. And finally, in 1974, they just unceremoniously fired him. He is bitter in this book. And he went to go back to being a writer. He was a copy editor for Billboard. And this book came out in 1975, and as far as the end of this book goes, that's what he did for a living. But there's a postscript, which is delicious. Remember I told you he wasn't a big fan of John Lennon? There's a really sick little story in here about John Lennon sneering at a bunch of kids that wanted autographs. Dexter thought he was a creep for being so grumpy about it, which, oh God, you know, when you think of how many people pursued them for autographs. At any rate, when John Lennon was assassinated in 1980, Dexter was a copy editor for Billboard, and the week he died, Lennon that is, Dexter wrote what can only be described as a hatchet piece about what a piece of shit John Lennon was. And he includes the story that's in this book. And it's really mean-spirited. And it's out there to find if you go looking for it. And needless to say, the response was unanimously negative from everybody. And Billboard mea culpa in their letters section. And you know what? That was the last we ever heard of Dave Dexter. And he died, I don't know when he died. And he's really this footnote in music history. His influence on an entire generation of music lovers, which was negative really, is completely undeniable. He wielded this awesome power to mold the biggest cultural phenomenon in decades. And he did it in his own image, which was completely inconsistent with what the artists wanted. So, as a bad guy, this guy takes some beating. I devoured this book. Well, the first half is kind of normal. And like I say, he's no dumbbell. He knows his music. But he hated rock and roll. He hated limeys. He hated non-American anything, really. And he was a pig-headed, opinionated asshole, which got him fired. So, he fought with John Lennon. Don't fight with your biggest artists. So anyway, it was a little bit of an object lesson. Despite that, I'm sure he got a good pension out of them. And, did okay. And I'm sure that when he disappeared from the scene, nobody at the Beatles headquarters shed a tear. So if it sounds like I've done a hatchet job on the guy, well, I think he fucking deserved it. I can't, other than signing Nat King Cole and helping Frank Sinatra get signed. And he signed Sammy Davis Jr., couldn't sell him. Signed Ella Fitzgerald, couldn't sell her. There's a lot more failures than successes in this book. So it's just one of those things where he had the biggest thing in the universe land in his lap and he didn't want it because he didn't think it was any good. Whereas somebody like Ahmet Ertegun would have that happen and he'd say, I don't like this, but there's something in this. Sonny and Cher was like that with Ahmet. He says, I don't understand this, but I know it's going to be big. So there's the difference between those guys. And there's my review of the guys that run the music industry. I hope you liked it. I'm still looking for things. By the way, my Dutch friend, Andy Kerr, who gave me Exploding, I need help identifying this flag. It appears to be Amsterdam. It's mostly a Dutch tricolor with two red Amsterdam X's in the middle, and then the canton, if you will, is a semicircle of black with a yellow one. And black, white, and red is the Amsterdam colors. So it looks like it's some kind of Amsterdam flag. So anybody who knows what the hell this is, put it in my comments. Because the Empress found this in a thrift store, and I really like it. But I want to know what it is. I make sure it's not like a National Socialist Party or something. Thanks for watching. Take care of each other. It's a tough little period lately. The red light is flashing faster, which means that there's going to be an explosion in not very long. So I better sign off and defuse whatever it is that's going to explode. I got more of these. I got maybe a few more. My next one will probably be about record producers, because I got quite a few books by them too. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and enlist or whatever the hell it is you do. And if you like this, leave comments, and if you got any suggestions, let me know. I'm all ears. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.